Now, our next speaker is Professor Bill Laurance, and he's going to tell you on what we have to lose. I'll give you an introduction for Bill. He's a distinguished research professor at James Cook University, and he holds an Australian Laureate Fellowship, which is one of Australia's highest scientific awards. And he also holds the Prince Bernhard Chair in International Nature Conservation in the Netherlands. Bill received his PhD from the University of California in Berkeley in 1989, and his research focus is on the impacts of intensive land uses, such as habitat fragmentation, logging, hunting, and wildfires on tropical forests and the subsequent impacts on biodiversity. He's also interested in protected areas, climate change, the impacts of roads and other infrastructure on biodiversity, and on conservation policy. And he has researched over the past 35 years spanning the tropical world, and it includes the Amazon, Africa, Asia-Pacific regions. And to date, he has published 8 books and over 400 scientific and popular articles. He's a leading voice for conservation, and Bill believes that scientists must actively engage policymakers and the general public, as well as other scientists. He's a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and he's a former president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. Bill has received many scientific honours, including a BBVA Frontiers in Ecology and Conservation Biology Award, a distinguished service... He loves this. Now you know why we're so proud to have our speakers here tonight. We really have got some talent. A Distinguished Service Award from the Society for Conservation Biology and the Heineken Environment Prize. He is also founder and director of ALERT, which is the Alliance of Leading Environmental Researchers and Thinkers, a group that advocates for environmental sustainability. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great honour of presenting you with our first speaker, Professor Bill Laurance.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. And in the 2 minutes remaining that I have in my time slot, no,
you shouldn't have such an illustrious career, Bill. You may have more time.
Well, my wife will give you another opinion on that one. Well, thank you very much to Kathy and to Cheryl and to Steve for inviting me to come talk to you today. As I think is going to become readily apparent, in fact, until I began speaking with them, I essentially knew nothing about KUR-World. My main point of puzzlement was why anybody would want to name a development after a feral dog. But what I would like to do is to talk a little bit generally about some of these kinds of development issues and a little bit about the context of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area and that sort of thing. Now, you've already seen this slide, joke slide. Environmental researchers are kind of famous for having lots of doom and gloom kinds of scenarios, and I actually want to say that one of the things that we try fairly hard to do is to not fall into that trap and actually to be to look at things objectively, look at the scientific evidence, not to leap to blindingly pessimistic conclusions, and essentially to use an evidence-based approach in trying to sort of evaluate different kinds of development projects. Now, that having been said, one doesn't have to engage in a lot of hand-waving in order to be pretty concerned about what's happening in the tropics. So tropical forests, using relatively conservative numbers, are being destroyed at a rate of about 20 fields a minute. That's about 10 million hectares per year. And it's not just the destruction, the outright destruction of forests, but it's a whole panoply of other changes that are happening simultaneously. So it's habitat fragmentation and industrial logging and surface fires and exotic pathogens and invasive species and climate change and edge effects, and it's really just this synergism. It's the interaction of all these different kinds of threats. In other words, if we were engaging in some kind of battle with nature, nature's not just getting sort of one jab, but in fact there's a whole flurry of punches and blows landing simultaneously. And really it's the combined effect of all those, of that assault, that's what we need to think about when we're talking about impacts on the natural world. Now, one of the things that's sort of emblematic of all this kind of new pressure, of course we hear a lot about climate change, but in fact what's happening on the ground, particularly with things like development and infrastructure and other kinds of major land use changes, these are actually probably more important in terms of their immediate and their critical impacts. And one just example of this is road development. we're living in the most drastic and rapid period of road expansion in human history. For instance, the number of kilometers of roads in the developing countries of Asia are going to double in the next 3 years. By the middle part of the century, it's projected that we're going to have about another 25 million kilometers of new paved roads, which is enough to encircle the world more than 600 times. There's currently being projected or built or imminently planned about 4,000 large-scale hydroelectric dams, energy projects, oil and gas exploration and development projects, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. Everywhere you look, particularly in the developing world, what you see is an incredible wave of new development pressures, and it really is game-changing in its nature. Now, Australia, of course, has been somewhat different from that. Of course, there's been a history of quite extensive land use here, but particularly when we're talking about the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area, this is an area that's been substantially protected. And I think it's important to emphasize just how critical and how really unique this area is. Firstly, in the Australian context, it's only about 1,000th of Australia's continental land area. And yet, a major analysis which sort of looked at the biogeographic and the biological uniqueness and irreplaceability of different ecosystems on the planet. So this was over 173,000 different protected areas on the planet, ranked the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area as the 6th most critical and irreplaceable. Of World Heritage areas, it was the 2nd most critical and irreplaceable. I think this just gives you a global perspective on what we're talking about here. Anybody from anywhere on the planet looking around would say this is absolutely critical biological and environmental real estate. You would not want to risk it from an international, from a global perspective for lots of different reasons. When we look at this long story of the evolution of rainforests and why the Australian rainforests are considered so critical, one of the things that we see is that these are among the most ancient rainforests on the planet. They go right back to the beginnings of rainforests in Gondwana land in western Gondwana. We know that there's all kinds of different species that are, some people refer to as living fossils or green fossils because there's so many archaic species of plants and animals that live in these rainforests. Also extremely high endemism. So what that means is that many species occur here and they only occur here. They don't occur anywhere else. In fact, oftentimes they won't occur throughout the entire wet tropics. They might be restricted to just a very specific area, a very specific elevation. In some cases, even just a single valley. For instance, this Kuranda Myala tree frog is one of these highly restricted species. If you looked at a map of Australia, it would look like its entire geographic range would look like a little pinprick. Okay? So essentially what we're talking about is an area with a great deal of biological uniqueness, no matter how we want to measure it, but certainly from a planetary perspective, from a global perspective. Now, another thing about tropical rainforests is that we tend to get a lot of ecological specialists and behavioral specialists, and it's an artifact of these ecosystems being so ancient, going back many tens of millions of years, of having a very unique architecture and microclimate and species composition, and species having had such a long period of time to specialize and to evolve into unique niches and to evolve different kinds of adaptations. And just as one example here, you can look at this plant right here and you can see the praying mantis living on that plant. I assume you do. There's the head, there's the body, there's the leg. Bottom line is you don't have to think too hard to imagine what would happen to that praying mantis if the plant on which it survives were to happen to disappear. And just everywhere we look, plant-animal interactions, pollination interactions between plants and fungi, interactions between plants and their seed dispersers. It is a tremendously complex web of interactions, and really it is the highest, most gloriously developed example of coevolution and of evolutionary complexity that we see pretty much on the planet. It's also important to emphasize that there's still lots of stuff we don't know about tropical rainforests. One of the simple things is just documenting what's here. These are among the better known rainforests in the world because there's been there's a good number of prominent Australian biologists that have worked here, but still many new things are being discovered. If you put some fog, insecticidal fog up into the rainforest canopy. Typically what you might have is something like 60%, 70%, 80% of the species that fall down to the forest floor may well not be even known to science. They may be unique to science. So some studies that have been happening in Latin America have found even higher percentages than that. So there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of things living, cryptic biodiversity, hidden biodiversity in different parts of the rainforest. And even some vertebrates. This is the prehensile-tailed mouse. You might have heard about that. It was first discovered by a CSIRO biologist, Frank Crome's mother-in-law's cat. Walked in one day with the first known specimen of this thing. Frank Crome happened to be one of the people that said that doesn't look quite right. He stole it from the cat. Cat went off. Came back a little while later, had another one in its mouth. So he got the second one off of it. And lightning strike me if I lied. Cat came back a little while later with a third one. He said it was more challenging to get the third one off of the cat, but he did eventually get it. So for a long time, those were the three specimens known from Australia, were thanks to Frank Crome's mother-in-law's cat. This is a golden-tipped bat, just another species. It was known from New Guinea, never been found in Australia until they used a completely new kind of bat trap. Turned out this thing was a specialist in the rainforest, and when you catch bats, traditionally what you use is these mist nets, these very delicate little nets used for catching bats and for birds. When they caught the first one of these things using this heart trap, which is a completely different kind of a trap, they opened it up, they took it as a specimen, they opened it up, and you know what they found inside its stomach? Nothing but spiders. So it turns out this thing is a spider specialist. So it's adapted for fluttering around in front of these delicate spider webs and basically plucking the spiders right off the web. So you can imagine why you'd never catch it in these nets. It's probably flying around looking for the massive spider that had built this huge web. Now, so the forests here are very restricted in area. They're already under a lot of pressures. They're naturally small. They're naturally fragmented. We know there's been a legacy of very extensive land use. For instance, about 70% of the lowland forests have been destroyed. A lot of the upland forests and the Atherton tablelands and Evelyn tablelands have also been cleared and fragmented. There are many kinds of pressures happening here in terms of edge effects, climate change, exotic pathogens. For instance, we know the chytrid fungus has pretty much wiped out, either completely driven to extinction or driven to the verge of extinction, 14 species of Australia's rainforest frogs. There's just a large array of different kinds of environmental impacts and pressures that are ongoing, ranging from water harvesting to fragmentation edge effects, changing fire regimes, just a whole suite of things that are already happening right now. The specter of climate change is quite alarming to many people because there are a large number of species that only occur at high elevations in these forests here, middle and upper elevations. And as the world gets warmer, these things don't really have anywhere to go except for heaven. So bottom line is there's a lot of vulnerability, a lot of concern that they'd be shrinking and fragmenting their geographic ranges with warmer and warmer world. Now, I spoke to Neil Bolin today, who's the principal environmental scientist with NRA Consulting, and he's a good guy. He's a pretty good guy. And I just asked him a few brief questions about this, about the operation here. And again, emphasizing I'm by no means any kind of expert. But one of the interesting things is this, the KUR-World and the company that would hold it is privately held. And one thing that we have had quite a lot of experience around the world working with Chinese corporations, public-private partnerships, private corporations, and other kinds of entities. And it is interesting when you're dealing with a privately held corporation, you don't tend to have, you don't have stockholders, you don't have boards of directors. Basically, you're dealing with the whims of an individual. And I think that was interesting, consistent with some of Steve's comments about a lack of certainty about what exactly is being planned, and this whole situation seems to be pretty soft. It's very clear that the main base of investment is going to be coming out of southern China, particularly the Hong Kong area. So this is an area where, and China is a massive investor right now in different parts of the world, a massive foreign investor, and in developing countries and also, of course, in places like Australia. The current plan is that there are going to be up to 4,000 people on the site. Definitely some of those will be permanent residents. One of the questions, and it's also clear that some of those projects are going to then be sold off. So there's no plan basically for a single title holder or corporation to hold that. The idea is to basically sell it to maximize the profit, and then what you'll end up is you'll have a diversity of different landholders and title holders, which then one has to deal with, which makes it actually considerably more challenging. I asked Neil whether there would be, one of the reasons I wanted to know whether there were going to be permanent residents is because if you in Australia, if you own a permanent abode, the traditional legal situation has been your home is your castle, and that means you can have domestic cats, you can have domestic dogs, you can have domestic animals. I said, would that be the circumstance here? He said he was hoping it would not be. He was hoping there would be some kind of safeguards brought in that would somehow allow that not to happen. But as of the moment, there's nothing in place that would give any assurance that that would not happen. Much remains uncertain, and I think Steve really hit that on the head. And he said, well, it was interesting when I talked to Neil, the one thing he said to me wasn't entirely straight up, was he said, oh, well, you know, Ken Lee, he's from Melbourne, and he's pretty Aussie. And I said, well, hang on a second, I heard about Ken Lee. And firstly, his English evidently is very difficult to understand, and he actually has only spent a limited amount of time in Melbourne. He lives in Hong Kong. So I think, from my understanding, and I think his business entrepreneurial attitude and approach is probably going to be much more typical of a Chinese investor than probably an investor that we might see operating perhaps as an Australian. Now, I can't be certain of that, but that's based on a certain amount of personal experience. Now, I wanted to say a little bit about, we're working a lot in areas and in nations that are being affected by large-scale Chinese investments. Jeff Sayre, Professor Jeff Sayre, who's one of my colleagues at JCU, also Gary Wilson here, another good colleague, knows about this. Jeff has collaborated with us on this work, and one of his former PhD students has done a lot of work on this, Chinese student. But China has been instrumentally involved in investments, especially around large-scale mining investments, bulk mining investments, that would involve massive increases in transportation infrastructure, more than 53,000 kilometers of new roads, highways, and also associated energy and transportation and water infrastructure with those projects. Typically what would happen is there would be a so-called anchoring project, which might be a large iron mine or a coal mine or a copper mine, and then there would be a large corridor, a road or railway or both oftentimes, connecting that then to a port, which would then be exporting that to China. So we were interested in the impacts of this. This, by the way, this is a Congolese national, but he was poaching, obvious poacher. He's inside a national park. He was alongside a road selling these mustache monkeys to anybody that happened to want to come by and buy them. But I just thought that this, this China-Congo handshake alliance here was, I don't know, just touched something in me. So we've spent quite a lot of time working in Africa. Returned recently from doing about a 2,000-kilometer road trip through Africa with one of my postdocs and another colleague. And you do see a tremendous amount of development activity. This is one of my recent postdocs, Mahmoud, who's a Nigerian national. When I first started taking photos of Mahmoud, he kept smiling, and I said, no, don't smile when you're, I said, do something. And he said, well, what do you mean do? He said, I said, well, look scientific. So we got very good at that. So he's looking very scientific right now. But when you drive around and you go through these areas, what you see are very large landscapes that are being extremely rapidly developed. And sometimes it's for timber, a lot of times it's for minerals. The Chinese are very involved in clearing and in infrastructure expansion and in a whole set of activities around the development. The Chinese entrepreneurs are very well known to be actively involved in bribery and corruption and graft. In fact, one of the complaints, I've been working, as I said, as Cheryl mentioned, 35 years in developing countries, so I've seen graft and corruption in some of its finer forms. But really not seen it as blatant as we experienced traveling through a large number of locations within Cameroon and Congo. And one of the things that people kept saying is, well, what's happened is we're not getting paid because the Chinese are coming in and they're bribing the top person, and that top person is then getting very enriched. But typically what would happen in the past was that Europeans would come in and they would give what they called gifts, but at least they would spread it around. It would be much more democratic in the way it was happening. And so the Chinese model of operating is very different, but what it has really done is opened a great number of doors for them. And you just see, this is a Chinese-operated gold mine. You see this type of thing happening everywhere. There were tailing ponds associated with this, which would have very high concentrations of mercury and zinc and cadmium and other kinds of heavy metals, and there were local village kids swimming and playing, you know, in these tailing ponds. And I think that you would say, generally speaking, that in this wave, this almost unbridled wave of development, again, a lot of it being fueled by heavy foreign investments coming from China, a lot of the local peoples, the indigenous Pygmy tribes and other groups that would be living in these areas are really, in many cases, coming up short. They're just being marginalized, and they're not the ones who are gaining the economic advantage. There's a relatively small number of individuals that are becoming much more enriched. And what you'd like to see when you have this kind of large-scale investment is you'd like to think of all the sectors of the economy and all the people being little boats, and you'd like to think of all the boats in the economy rising. In fact, that's not what's happening. Some individuals and some sectors are doing really well, and in fact, when you're getting inflation, the poorer people are actually falling behind because the cost of food and living is getting more and more expensive for them, and they're not gaining very much at all from this sort of wave of investment. Another thing that we see associated with all this infrastructure and all these new roads and new logging activities is more and more poaching. This is inside a national park. This is Mahmoud here, and you can tell that this elephant was killed by a poacher because its face is hacked off, and that's what they do. They want the ivory, and so when they kill the elephant, they hack off the whole front of the face so they can get right up to the roots of the ivory tusks. So it's pretty much a clear signature. Now, we used an evidence-based approach where we looked at a cost-benefit framework, and this was looking at those 53,000 kilometers of development corridors that are being planned or have been approved already or are under construction. And it's interesting that we found a very large number of them were marginal or inadvisable according to our analysis framework. And so, what a lot of them are going to be doing is opening up remote, sparsely populated areas, hinterland areas of Africa, to what could potentially become very large-scale land development and land transformation. So this is going to have an absolutely, if it proceeds as it's being orchestrated right now, an absolutely massive impact on the African continent, the African ecosystem. Now, to jump to KUR-World, again, this is all really pretty new stuff for me. I just wanted to provide some general perspectives on this. Again, one of the obvious things is this is, by any measure, one of the most biologically critical areas of the planet, and it's renowned for having all these so-called rare endemic species. So these are things that are going to occur in a very, very tiny part of the world. These are some of the species that have been documented to be restricted or rare or localized endemics that occur within this general area, within the area of the project area. Notably, the northern bettong or tropical bettong is not there, but this project would be smack in the middle of the two known populations. So there's one in the Lamb Range and there's one on the Windsor Tableland, and this would be, in fact, putting additional pressures. If there were any gene flow, if there were any movement, if there were any connectivity between those two relic populations of this critically endangered Australian native species, this development would be almost certainly slamming the door on that kind of demographic and genetic movement. So another thing you'd say is, you're really in a hot spot for a lot of species. Another thing is, just generally speaking, landscape context, biogeographic context is critical. What we're in right here is really one of the critical bottlenecks. It's really the critical bottleneck. It's the so-called Black Mountain Biogeographic Corridor. It's the narrowest choke point for the wet tropics, and in the event of climate change or other kinds of changes, species have historically migrated or moved along these kinds of corridors. And what you generally don't want to, in these bottlenecks, is you don't want to elevate land use pressures. You don't want to choke these bottlenecks even further by additional kinds of development pressures. That's just one of the general kinds of principles that you try to adhere to. Another really important, and I'd say this is absolutely critical conclusion that we've drawn from working in the center I direct, we're working in more than 40 different nations around the world. Our own group works in a couple dozen different nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, is that it's for these big development projects, almost as a generality, not always, but almost as a generality, it's the secondary effects, it's the knock-on effects of the transportation infrastructure and the water infrastructure and the energy infrastructure and the land use change pressures and everything else going on, the migration, that is actually more important than the project itself. So you might have a hydroelectric dam, or you might have a mine or something like that, but in fact it's the hundreds of kilometers of roads and
energy, power lines and gas lines and other things that open up the frontier, those have bigger impacts oftentimes than the actual project itself. So I think that's just an important principle to bear in mind. And when we talk about these kinds of developments, they're going to have impacts on stream systems and on high rainfall tropical environments. You're going to have issues around water impoundment, impeding water flows. You're obviously going to have issues around sedimentation and siltation, erosion and sedimentation of streams. Typically what you'll see, for instance, in a selectively logged area, traditionally tropical rainforest streams are extremely clean. They're beautiful water. You can drink the water. On average, you would get about a 10,000-fold increase in the sediment load in the streams, say for instance in the first couple of years after selective logging, after industrial selective logging. So it gives you some notion, and I think Steve showed, you get some sense of how heavy the sediment loads can be. Again, remembering that these are environments that are getting very high rainfall, also extremely high rainfall associated with cyclone events. Roadkill, of course, is an important phenomenon that happens when you get more road development. One of the interesting things is people have traditionally not thought, biologists have not thought of roadkill as an especially important driver of extinction, but some of the latest generation so-called population viability models are suggesting that the species that are vulnerable to roadkill, for those, actually road-related mortality can in fact be one of the more important drivers of population extinction. So it's interesting that they can be important. Some of the tropical species we know are incredibly specialized for tropical environments. They've evolved, again, tens of millions of years in these very, structurally and microclimatically dark, dense, microclimatically stable environments. And this is some work from my wife's PhD in the Amazon. We know that those roads will just stop, dead stop in their tracks, some species from moving. I mean, it's really kind of remarkable. Things like a lot of the understory birds can be very vulnerable. The Lemuroid ring-tailed possum, which is a species that's endemic to this area, is pretty much stopped dead by any kind of clearing. There's a number of different kinds of species, some of the specialized arboreal species. Susan found in her work that, for instance, there's birds that mate for their entire life with a single individual. They're monogamous their entire life, and they spend their whole life on one territory. You can catch one of those birds, you can move it kilometers away inside the rainforest, and usually within the same day, it's back on its territory. You can move it across a 100-meter wide clearing, which would be the kind of clearing you might see associated with a highway, and they will not go back. Okay? They will not go back to their lifetime mate. They will not go back to their lifetime territory. They are halted by that clearing, and I think it gives you some indication of how specialized these things can be. We also know that the roads and the road bridges can be corridors for invasions. For instance, cane toads will use logging roads to invade intact areas of forest, and there's lots of different kinds of species that use these. These roads are really the corridors for invasions, or the corridors for colonization. Pretty much everywhere we look, we see roads completely transforming everything. For instance, our work in the Amazon has shown that 95% of all the forest destruction in the Amazon occurs within 5.5 kilometers of a legal or illegal road. Okay? And if you want to know where deforestation is happening, if you want to know where it's going to happen, if you want to plan it, if you want to predict it, just look at where the roads are and look at where the transportation infrastructure is going to be. So really they do have transformative effects. Now, another general principle is, and we see this in lots of places, for instance in the Asia-Pacific region, what you'll typically see is large corporations, and then they'll have a whole set of subsidiaries. And they will put in there might be some kind of land claim where they're allowed to claim up to 2,000 hectares, but what they'll do is they'll branch off into all these subsidiaries, and then they'll have Joe and Bob and Joe's uncle and Bob brother. And what they do is they put in all these claims, and they treat these as though they're separate entities. And also it becomes very, very hard to track the money and to track the compliance. So this is a very common phenomenon. It's a whole set and what's clearly going to be happening with this project, this KUR-World, is it's going to be designed to be sold off to multiple landowners, and there'll be land speculation happening, but there may also be this kind of subsidiary effect happening as well. So it's going to be difficult for the people that are trying to manage the environmental impacts to handle these kinds of circumstances. It's more difficult than if you're dealing with a single landowner. One more thing, a couple more things I want to say. Almost everywhere you look in the world, the environmental impact assessments, or so-called strategic environmental assessments and social assessments, almost never capture what's really going to happen. Because these projects drag with them migration and economic changes and land speculation and other land use changes and a whole suite of things. And they're just not captured within the terms of reference of environmental impact assessment. Even when they try, nobody's really been able to do that. So don't believe it if they tell you they've done an EIA and it's all going to be okay, because it's not happening anywhere in the world. And even, even in the best governed countries in the world, which Australia would be among the better ones. TESS is our center at JCU, Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science. Cheryl and Kathy came down and gave us a brief talk about KUR-World, and I just wanted to finish up by saying we've got some resources that you might find helpful, because we do a lot of work on development and on infrastructure and on its impacts in different parts of the world. For instance, we have a lot of these simple one-pagers in lots of different languages. By the way, we produce things in a number of different languages. But English, obviously, but also Bahasa and PNG Pidgin and other languages. And if you want, I will get Kathy to send you, and you can have PDFs of these. But they have cartoons, and they got lots of little simple, punchy things about why you need to worry about and what you need to worry about. And also, we have a series of these 3-minute or 2-minute videos, which really try to hit on some of these key points. And we've done them, everything from Mandarin Chinese to French to Spanish to Portuguese to English, obviously. So we can send you hyperlinks, and you can just go on and bang, go on to YouTube. We've even got them accessible in China. And believe me, that was not easy, because you can't access you can't access YouTube in China. You can't access a lot of things that we can normally access. But we've managed to get around those firewalls, and we actually have these videos now being available in China as well. And then finally, Cheryl mentioned Alert. If you're not part of Alert already, it's absolutely free. This is run by a group of scientists. We're just trying to tell people about big environmental changes happening around the world. It's grown pretty dramatically since we started in 2003. We currently have a little over, on average, 700,000 people a week reading it. Doesn't cost you a dime. About once a week you'll get something that will say, here's an important environmental trend happening in the world, here's an important thing. And then if you want, there's hyperlinks and you can get involved, you can learn more about it. But very simple, very short stories, lots of photos, just designed to be a user-friendly way to try to get information. But anyway, I thank you very much for the invitation. Probably sorry for talking a little bit over time, but hopefully now we're all seeing eye to eye on some of the important issues we need to be concerned about. So, thanks a lot.